after watching the Seahawks dominate the Super Bowl. My only thoughts are, how far behind are the Texans from reaching the ultimate pinnacle in hosting the Lombardi Trophy?
You are Locked On Texans, your daily podcast on the Houston Texans. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Battle Red Nation, from H-Town to your town. Today's episode and every episode of the Locked On Texans podcast is for Texan fans all around. Shout out to my everydayers from the Himalayas for making the Locked On Texan podcast your first listen of the day, and for making the Locked On Network the number one sports podcast in the nation. After watching Sunday's game, how should Texan fans feel? Right, everything was almost there. We've talked about it somewhat ad nauseum. You were so close. But after seeing how the New England Patriots performed, you kind of feel like you would have had a shot if you were able to get over the turnovers and if you were able to get over the inexistent run game. We're going to talk about all of that on today's show, because it's also important to discuss Caserio's role moving forward. If he doesn't get it right in the 2026 offseason, ladies and gentlemen, he may waste the window. I've said it once and I'll say it again. He is extremely pivotal in the success moving forward for the Houston Texans. And defense still wins championship, guys. The defense still wins championships. And here's the good thing. Here's the blessing. Not even in disguise. This is what we see. This is the blessing for Houston. DeMeco got that defense locked and loaded, so Houston can still win a championship. The window is about 2 to 3 years, in my opinion. They still have an opportunity to get to the promised land. But before we dive into that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The winter games are on, so you check that out, and there's no better way to follow them than a bet on. They want to bet on FanDuel. Play your game on FanDuel. So saw tweets, right? The moment the Houston Texans lost, DeMeco isn't going to be the coach that's going to get him over the hump. You got people, in the media that's coming out of nowhere once again with their criticism of DeMeco. I'm like, he just won every game for 2 months. Now all of a sudden the sky's falling down. Whether you believe he should have pulled C.J. Stroud at halftime, whether or not you believe Davis Mills would have been able to win that game for Houston, whether or not you believe that, whether it's the last game of the year or the first game of the year, whatever you believe, DeMeco Ryans deserves some grace, right? In my opinion, it's clear Nick Caserio has to cultivate the roster to get Houston where they need to be. Mike McDonald has done what I think many of you at home in the comment section have said before. A lot of times, maybe on the Squash Show, my co-host of the Texas Squash Show, Stan Norfleet, loves to point out, defensive coaches are not winning Super Bowls in modern football. McDonald just did it. And I can't wait to talk about that. We got the Squash Show later Tuesday evening. McDonald did it. A defensive-minded head coach won a Super Bowl for the first time since 2018. And again, many Texas fans on social media saw that Patriot performance, and the consensus was that should have been us, right? And I understand why you'd feel that way. Stroud was bad. I get it. He was terrible in that Patriot game. But after watching the Patriots in that Super Bowl, the thought is, we can get back. If I'm a Texas fan out there, it was a defensive performance from start almost to the finish of the game, especially in the first half. The score was 9-0 in the first half. It was a defensive battle, and you have the defense, Texas fans, to get to the pinnacle. But as I've mentioned before, yes, you can place blame on C.J. Stroud. Wholeheartedly believe you have the right to do that. But other elements were just as bad. And really, Houston's entire offensive operation was disjointed from the start, with poor offensive line play to an inexistent run game. And, when I look at the Seattle team in comparison to Houston, and why Seattle was able to get to the Super Bowl in the first place, Let's look at a few things. Seattle's defense was number one. Houston ended the season number two. They were number one and number two, flipping, flopping throughout the entire season. Both had historic runs this year. Both had a quarterback that many feel needs more around to lift the offense than the other way around. Neither have a Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, neither have a top 5 quarterback. So the pieces around those quarterbacks and CJ Stroud and Sam Darnold oftentimes have to elevate the offense, and that's where you'll see the best version of each quarterback. But here's the biggest difference, and this is where the biggest difference lies in why Houston was ultimately held back and why Seattle continued to thrive. John Schneider versus Nick Caserio. That's a conversation that needs to be had. When I look at the draft picks since 2022, Charles Cross, Bo Mafe, Kenneth Walker, Abraham Lucas, Kobe Bryant, Reek Woolen, 23, Devin Witherspoon, JSN, Derek Hall, 24, Byron Murphy, 25, Gray Zabel, Nick Amararu, excuse me if I mispronounced their name. Also in 24, AJ Barner, 25, Elijah Arroyo, 23, Zach Charbonnet, right? 23, Anthony Bradford. The foundation was laid out for both sides of the ball. And in comparison to the playoffs in the postseason, where did Seattle thrive during the postseason? 175 yards on the ground versus the 49ers, 141 on the ground in the Super Bowl. These are the two games where the quarterback didn't have to save the offense. And again, they took Charles Cross in the first round, Kenneth Walker in the second round, Lucas in the third. That's 313 yards and 4 TDs from Walker, and a combined 6 pressures between Cross and Abraham. Compare that to Houston's 2023 draft class, where they hit big on Stroud and Will Anderson. They hit big, but Juice and Patterson have not been a stable option to block up front on the inside. That's been a revolving door. Tank has been great when he's on the field. He's played in only 25 games in 3 seasons. That's just on the offensive side of the ball. I remember seeing many negative tweets about DeMeco and his future as a possible Super Bowl winning champion for the city of Houston and the Texans franchise. What the hell are you guys talking about? He's still on that trajectory. The difference is the product. The difference in the product is that while McDonald's defense got all the tools to be a stout unit, he and Schneider stay consistent with how they went about putting together a competitive roster and never neglected the offense or retooled what was lost. They never failed to do that. This is where, in my opinion, Nick Caserio really held Houston back. In back-to-back drafts, Seattle drafted running backs in the second round. Same with Bo Mafe and Hall on the defensive side of the ball in 2022 and 23. Same with the tight end position in 2024 and 2025. They went out and got AJ Barner in 24. They went out and got Elijah Arroyo in 25. But for Houston, they get your Dalton Schultz as free agency, right? Great move. Then they follow up, they bank on Brevin Jordan. Right, this is some of the things that curses Houston at times. They bank on a very uber athletic and talented tight end in Brevin Jordan, but the injury history is the concern. So they bank on him. They bank on a project tight end in Cade Stover. And then in the 2025 draft, they drafted tight end in Luke Lachey in the 7th round, neglecting the tight end unit, right? The Seattle Seahawks built the offense through the draft just as good as how Houston built their defense through the draft. So when I hear the narratives around DeMeco and whether or not Ryans can win it all, I look at what Seattle just did, and I get to comparing their run this season, and I can't help but to think if DeMeco has someone who's won it before, maybe the roster construction would not be as bad, and maybe the ending of the season will look a lot different for Houston. Schneider won it before with Seattle. He helped put together the Legion of the Boom, but he won it as the general manager. He's been around it. Now, I know Nick Caserio has won championships with the New England Patriots. I'm not discrediting that at all. But for Seattle, Schneider has been the guy since 2010. Now we look at moving forward. Like, guys, you have, like I said, watching that Super Bowl, even as a fan of the team that lost and got embarrassed, by the way, so get your jokes off, I couldn't help but think, man, small tweaks would have gotten it right for Houston. And those small tweaks, I lay on the general manager and the negligence at time of making sure the roster is fulfilled to the best of the ability that he can put together a roster. And I think at times he's failed the Houston Texans. I really do. Now, more Locked On Texans on the other side, because now we got to look at what's Caserio's role moving forward, while also revisiting some of his decisions that may be quote unquote downfall. More Locked On Texans talk on the way. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The winter games are officially here. And if you're anything like us, you're locking in for events you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. And that's why following the winter games on FanDuel just makes all the sense in the world, from medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on the sports you care about the most. FanDuel gives you more ways to stay connected to the action. The drama of curling matches to start slow and somehow get intense fast. Speed skating races decide by inches. The winter games are really fun, guys. FanDuel keeps the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. The winter games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Going to be a fun and interesting week here on the Locked On Texans podcast. I want to let you guys in on something that I can't wait to talk about. Dalton Schultz mentioned him having comfortability in this offense under Nick Caley. And it came off as he was a one-off, or maybe he and Nico was a one-off. And I kind of want to revisit some things that I noticed during training camp, of which, I was real irritated by the lollygagging term that was used early in the season for the Houston Texans by franchise quarterback C.J. Stroud. This was one of those off seasons and training camps where, I thought that I would see a more commanding C.J. Stroud. No Stephon Diggs out there on the offensive side of the ball. No Tank Dell out there to at least practice. May have been around. He was around during training camp, but this was one of those moments where at the end of the 24 season, you would hear rumors, and even here on the show, I talked about it a little bit with C.J. Stroud because I had an opportunity to ask him a question. Essentially, what's an offense that he liked to run? And he mentioned both L.A. and the Patriots, and so for Houston to go out and get a Nick Caley in the offseason last year, I thought would have spoken to his wants and needs, and I thought that would have, kind of galvanized Stroud a little bit. But I kind of wonder, and this is what the Houston Texans does, how much did they downplay that shoulder injury? Because you look at some of the missed throws this year, then also starting off training camp, you would see C.J. Stroud tossing the ball and not throwing it, didn't participate early on. But you see Davis Mills throwing the ball, knowing what he has to do, going through walkthroughs. There's somewhat of a half speed, and I'm wondering, okay, was the shoulder still a problem that Houston didn't want to talk about? It. They don't want to talk about Joe Mixon's injury. That they give you updates now and then on Tank Dell. But this isn't a team that talks about injuries a lot. They keep everything in house. So I look at the approach to the offense from a quarterback perspective last year, and I can't help but to think, why is Dalton Schultz and Nico Collins the only one that C.J. Stroud has this comfortability with? Obviously, those are vets. Dalton Schultz has been a successful tight end in this league for a long time. Nico Collins, the last 3 years under C.J. Stroud, 3 consecutive 1,000-yard receiving seasons. And so obviously they already have their own connection there. But I would have liked to see more from Stroud in the early stages of putting this offense together during training camp. Y'all remember the reports The defense won another day. The defense won another day. The defense. Well, the offense progressed a little bit today. The defense won another day. So I'm wondering how this year will shape CJ Stroud moving forward. I'm wondering how this year will shape Stroud and his relationship with Nick Caley, of which he said they've grown a lot. And I think when we hear people say Nick Caley, isn't bad, he should move on, and things of that nature, we also have to consider that Caley properly assessed the offensive line issue and moved towards getting the ball out quicker. So DeMeco Ryans talked about Caley at the beginning of the season, and he talked about his thoughts on adjustments, and he made some adjustments. Now, moving forward, Seattle won by controlling the line of scrimmage. Houston couldn't do that against New England. Running the ball, Houston couldn't do that against New England. And the biggest of all, a general manager understanding that when change is needed, don't repeat your first mistake. Houston can get back to where they finished last season and beyond. But boy, this is Caserio's most critical offseason yet. Texans need to revamp their running back room. Right? There's no way around it. They ranked 29th out of 32 teams in average rushing yards per play in 2025. Houston running backs had 6 rushing TDs this year. And here's the thing. Sam Darnold was not good in the Super Bowl. Newsflash. He was not good in 2 of the 3 games this postseason. In the Super Bowl, Darnold was 10 of 13 for 88 yards in the first half with a couple of underthrows, and he was terrible in the red zone throughout the game. So, what's the difference? If Darnold was that bad, how was Seattle able to have an impact on the game? Kenneth Walker had 94 yards in the first half and helped get Seattle to the red zone, where ultimately they had to settle for 3 field goals. So what I'm getting at is, when the quarterback was not enough for one team that won the Super Bowl, what happened? The elements around that quarterback was still very good. For the Houston Texans, see, they had to fight up different. They had to fight against different elements. They had to fight the element of snow, the weather. They had to fight the element of not having Nico Collins. Not having Nico. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he went out the game with an injury, but before that injury, JSN was somewhat non-existent offensively, right? I mean, you want to talk about a matchup. You want to talk about a cornerback coming to play, and it would have been fun to see Stingley and JSN get it going again. But you want to talk about that. Gunzo was amazing Sunday. JSN, 4 catches, 27 yards from 10 targets. So, like, I just look at, in some ways, Seattle's offense being crippled a little bit, and how their crutch was, we got 5 dudes up front that can move a line. We got 5 dudes that can just move bodies. We got a running back with great vision, doesn't waste unnecessary steps in the backfield, gets upfield, good speed, knows when to bounce it out. That's how the Seattle Seahawks was able to create a 9-point lead going into halftime. And essentially, that's how Kenneth Walker won MVP. So, like, it's for Houston, the elements that they need to fix go hand in hand. They have to. They absolutely have to right their wrongs of a Jared Patterson or Juice Scruggs not panning out. And they got to get guys that can dominate on the inside, because that is what held the New England Patriots defense at bay. You had Kenneth Walker with runs of 30 and 29 in their first half. If the Texans don't address the interior offensive line, stop telling me you can put Titus Howard back at guard. If you guys are not listening, Titus Howard doesn't want to play guard. He's a team player, and he's going to make $27 million this year, but he don't want to play guard. He wants to be where he's best at. And oh, by the way, Titus Howard at guard, this is no disrespect to Titus Howard because I think he did good this year, all things considered. But Titus Howard at guard is not moving the needle because he's not moving the body consistently to open up rushing lanes. Put on the tape. Watch the games. They need body movers, Houston does. Seattle had that. 313 rushing yards in 3 postseason games. And they protected the quarterback well. And also, when I look at what's the issue for Houston moving forward, and they kind of have to live in it. McDonald's first year, he faced a tough decision in his first offseason. The Seattle Seahawks, they went 10-7, decent offensive year. I think they averaged around 22 points per game. But they wanted more offensive consistency. McDonald and Schneider replaced offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb with Klint Kubiak. Under Kubiak, the team scored 483 points, the most in franchise history, and the third most in the league, while also ranking top 10 for total yards, passing yards, and rushing yards. So again, I opened up this segment with this being a critical, year for Stroud and Caley because Houston's not moving on. They're not moving on. And when I look at what's next for Houston and compare it to Seattle, and the reason why I'm doing a lot of this comparison is because Seattle had that defense that was, top one, the number one in the league by a hair of my chin. Texans had the defense. Texans had the defensive-minded head coach. Texans had, a new offensive line coach in the first year with their team to help get it to a better state. The Texans and Seattle had many similarities between the two. But Schneider was just smart about putting this roster together and getting this team what it needs. And it showed. Seattle's offense was concise. Even when Sam Darnold was not good, the offense in itself, where it lacked, they were strong in other areas, and it was concise getting to their strengths. Houston didn't have a strength for real this year. Houston did not have, Seattle rushed for 2,000 yards on the year, and they had a great red zone offense, right? Houston did not have that simply because Seattle planned and drafted and brought over guys to help their personnel and boost their personnel to stick to their plan. They had a plan and the personnel to stick to it. Houston didn't. They told us all offseason coming into the season, we want to be a tough physical team that can run the ball. And then at one point, we see City Snow taking snaps at guard. And then they're rotating left guards. That is not a plan. And then they finally get Trent Brown back. And it seems as though Trent Brown was brought over to be the starting right tackle, but the injury held him out for half the season. Houston's offense never had a plan to start the year. It was very much so, let's scramble to figure this thing out. And that, to me, goes back to the quarterback's approach in the offseason. I think it'll be different this year. Super excited to see how C.J. Stroud grows from this past year, starting with training camp and the offseason, the whole nine. But the lack of a plan from the Houston Texans hurt them in the end offensively. And the lack of addressing needs from the Houston Texans offense hurt them in the end. So this is Caserio's role. His job this year, I got to get body movers on the inside. I got to revamp that off my running back room, and I got to get another tight end. The defense is set. You guys have sunken enough resources in the defense. Prioritize the offense with experience and players you can lean on. If their chart coming out of college say they have injury concerns, you may want to move on from them. If they're a great pass blocker but can't run block worth of that, you may want to move on from them. Look elsewhere. Look elsewhere. That's what Seattle did, and Seattle is hosting a Lombardi Trophy. Houston is not far off, guys. Stay with it. They're not far off. It's the small things that matter in the end. So how should Texas fans feel? Let's talk about that to close out today's show. Important to talk about how Texan fans feel, but it's also important to talk about tax season and how tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress of guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. So for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Thank you for making Locked On Texans your first listen of the day and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. If you haven't already, go check out our new Everydayer Club. Access to an ad-free audio feed for Locked On Texans, compatible with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other major podcasting platforms. This is also my invite to you to the members-only Locked On Everydayer Club Discord server, which includes a group chat just for listeners of this show, and I'll be hanging out there as well. Go to LockedOnTexans.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. Texan fans, how should you feel? You should feel defeated. This isn't me being funny either. You should feel defeated because it was so close. That's one emotion. There's two emotions here. See, some teams, maybe like the Dallas Cowboys, right? Oh, no, maybe like the New Orleans Saints, right? You know you still got work to do. Atlanta, you may be on the cusp, but you know you're a season or two away, right? Maybe like the Giants, right? You're a season or two away. You're making changes in the front office, making changes in your coaching staff. Maybe the coaching staff can bring over something different to help you get over the hump. But some teams know they are a season or two, and in some cases, 3 or 4 away. The Tennessee Titans, right? You know that that's the case for other teams. For Houston, it don't have to be that way. So while the first emotion should be upset, anger, pissed off, disappointed, frustrated because you watched a team that you knew you could have beaten if it wasn't for the lackadaisical play from your quarterback, right? You could have won that game. You could have beat the Bo Nicholas Broncos. You could have made it to the Super Bowl, right? Could have did all of that, but you didn't. You weren't able to do it. So you're frustrated. You're down on yourself. You're disappointed. That's the first emotion. But after watching Seattle, see, I think this is all. You look at Seattle and how they won. This is all proof that DeMeco's way can win it. And here's another thing. We always talk about whose decision was it for Nick Caley? Was Bobby Sloak DeMeco's boy? Is Nick Caley's Caserio's boy? Who wears Cole Popovich? Who's running the offense? Is it just DeMeco's worrying about the defense? Is it just whatever? There got to be a little bit more of cohesiveness moving forward for the Houston Texans, right? So I think we'll see a change in that atmosphere moving forward this year. I really do. I could be wrong, but a lot of times I don't think I'm wrong when it comes to where the Houston Texans stand and where they need to go. But that second emotion should 100% be, I feel optimistic. As long as you keep your head to the sky. Because with DeMeco, you can be optimistic. His way can win Houston the championship. Now, obviously, he has to be better with time management. And I think the Houston Texans should really invest in I don't know what the term would be, but like if they have a get-back coach, a time management coach. And that's for DeMeco and Nick Caley. But what was the difference between Seattle's defense and Houston's? 2 outstanding corners And we don't talk about Kalen Bullock's ascension this year and still gave Houston 4 interceptions and got better running at run tackling and coming downhill. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about how good Azeez really was this year. No, Houston doesn't have on the inside Leonard Williams type of guys or, Byron Murphy. Shout out UT. He's a dog. They don't got those guys in terms of names. But Houston's D tackles played some damn good football this year. Like Tim Settle and Sheldon Rankins and Tommy Togiai, they're not sexy names. But in terms of production, those are some guys. They got Daniel and Will out there. So what's the difference defensively? The difference between Seattle and Houston is Seattle in 2024, Mike McDonald's first year, they went with Ryan Grubb. That was his first time being an offensive coordinator in the NFL. They said, you know what? We appreciate you. Thank you so much. But we know where we want to go, and we're going to get better. And they go hire Klint Kubiak the year prior, who was in New Orleans. That was a McDonald and Schneider decision to get experience. The offensive line. Schneider rebuilding that offensive line from the previous era. And that great era where it was, you still had Geno and Pete Carroll, right? They had a playoff appearance one of those years. These are things that the Houston Texans have not done to the date. Now they're stuck with Nick Caley, right? So what can they do moving forward? Well, I think it's still important for Houston to invest in the offensive coaching staff. You guys want to say, well, it was, when they had what's the quarterback that went to U of H? Help me out, guys. Case Keenum. But Shane Day was a part of that. And when Shane Day, who's worked with great quarterbacks and helped quarterbacks, do their thing and offenses come together, when he left, right? So I think that it's important for Houston to invest in an offensive assistant if they're not going to move on from offensive coordinator. They got to get better, the offensive line. And again, when I talk about being optimistic, this is apparently clear. And Houston, who's invested a lot in the defense, don't have to prioritize that anymore. They can invest into the offense. And if Mike McDonald can win it for Seattle, by all means, shout out to Mike, man. He's done a phenomenal job in turning that over. DeMeco can do the same here in Houston. No doubt about it. Stop discrediting DeMeco Ryans because he's not the original pick you wanted to go with. And I'm talking to certain people. 10 wins, playoff win. It ain't all been pretty. Right, they get to the divisional round, they lose, and obviously McDonald has made it to the Super Bowl and won it in shorter time. Vrabel made it to the Super Bowl. Like other guys that made it to conference championships in shorter time or just as amount of time. But some of you guys, every time DeMeco loses, he's not the right guy. He's an emotional hire. When did winning get discredited? When? Texan fans should be optimistic about the future. Here's my asterisk. Where's your trust level on Caserio getting it done? Thank you for watching today's episode of the Locked On Texan podcast. Please be sure to subscribe, like, and comment on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast. Follow me on Twitter at John_Hickman12 and also on Instagram at SomeSportsGuy. Until next time, ladies and gents, Texan fans across the nation, peace.